Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. There's been this curious little trend the last couple of years, and it's ramped up in the last 6 months or so in the world of media, specifically in entertainment, where you've had a number of white men who have been saying that somebody is discriminating against them. They can't tell you who, but they say, take their word for it, it's totally happening. This is a meme that's been kicked around because apparently what's happened is ever since Obama became president, there's been this huge blow to the ego of some people. They feel as if, oh God, the end is nigh. One of the people who's jumped on the wine train is James Patterson, who's supposed to be a big author, but in reality he's just a crusty old hack who uses a bunch of ghostwriters to scribble out some nonsense for him, which he then slaps his name on. He has entire series of books that have his name on the front, so he's doing the same thing publishers have done with people like Tom Clancy and Michael Crichton, even though they're dead, or in the case of Patterson, brain dead, and putting their name on the front of a book like a brand logo or something. So even if you're one of the people who clearly isn't very literate and you think that James Patterson's some sort of great author, nonetheless, the book more than likely wasn't even written by him. They just were allowed to put his name on the front, that's all. Now, James Patterson came to prominence in the 90s for his Alex Cross novels, which became a couple of mediocre movies that were only watchable because Morgan Freeman played the role of Alex Cross. There was an attempt several years back to try to reboot the series, this time with Tyler Perry of all people. The end. This guy has somehow managed to sell over 450 million copies of his books, and yet for some reason, James Patterson of all people is trying to jump on some sort of victim bandwagon, complaining that white male writers aren't getting enough writing gigs. They're being discriminated against, and this is just another form of racism. Now, he wasn't complaining that white male writers can't get any writing jobs. He's not complaining that he walks in a room and there's nothing but a bunch of black folks there and he's the only white guy in the room. That's not his complaint. His complaint is that they don't get as many as they used to. Now, we're not going to get into the numbers right away, but we already know that white males are overrepresented when it comes to screenwriters, showrunners, TV producers, just hideously overrepresented. There is no argument here. This wasn't some fit of pique by James Patterson or some act of pent-up frustration. This is what he has thought for a long time. The writers' rooms for these TV shows are overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, as are the producers, the directors, and studio executives. It's a totally closed, hermetically sealed, all-white box that allows no one else in. And what's Patterson's gripe? He thinks that he's not getting as many writing gigs as he should be, and it must be because he's white. That's part of this little white supremacist meme that's been going around. Oh, all of these white male executives and producers and all these studio honchos, oh, these guys, they're discriminating against white males. Now, of course, we know what that is. That's basically them sending up not a dog whistle, but a foghorn saying, hey, you need to circle the wagons. You're not discriminating against enough black people. You need to be locking them out. That's what they're really saying. And to show how blatantly empty Patterson's whining is, he apologized for it just a day later. But does anyone truly believe that he apologized because he honestly realized that he was wrong? He knows that you can't tell a lie as big as the one that he told and then just walk it back. He understands full well that the intended audience for his words, the angry white supremacist males, would dismiss the phony apology, and that's the entire point. What he's done is the equivalent of throwing a rock and hiding his hands. Now, when you got a guy who's sold 450 plus million books, or however the hell many copies it's supposed to be, I am not so naive as to believe that this guy hasn't sold a few copies to some of the people who also happen to listen to me. I would bet there's a few of you who, because Alex Cross happens to be the protagonist of James Patterson's novels, that you decided that, hey, maybe you'll go ahead and become an Alex Cross devotee. I have no problem with that. But no black person's appreciation or adoration of any particular intellectual property or entertainment is supposed to be greater than your demand for respect. No matter what James Patterson may try to claim, it doesn't change what he is. This guy is dabbling in the exact same waters as the white replacement theory crowd. And that's the thing you find about a whole lot of these folk from the dominant society who try to come around black people and, they want black folks to think that they're just so nice and they're just so down. It doesn't matter if it's Norman Lear, doesn't matter if it's Quentin Tarantino. Well, hell, that guy, he wears his doggone prejudice like a badge of honor. But my point is, sooner or later, these guys always show their true colors. Black people are the reason that they had a ticket to ride. It's because of a black character, albeit a fictional one, that James Patterson even has a career. And yet, for some reason, this is what this guy turns around and does. I mean, you want another example? Drew Brees. That chucklehead, this guy was used up. People had already shipped him off to the glue factory, and it was the city of New Orleans who took him in. God, what an error. The city of New Orleans gave Drew Brees the one thing he was incapable of giving himself: a second chance. The only reason Drew Brees even had a career, the only reason he was given the privilege of setting whatever passing records he set, the only reason he may make it to the NFL Hall of Fame is because New Orleans gave him a career. They gave it to him. Everything he and his wife have, they owe to the black city of New Orleans. Because after Seattle or wherever the hell he was playing at in the Northwest, nobody wanted him. He wasn't just considered a long shot, he was considered a lost cause. It was a miracle New Orleans even took him. And he would have been totally forgotten were it not for a black city. And even if one or two football nerds did remember Drew Brees, it would have been as a low-talent quarterback with a gimp arm who washed out of the NFL and into obscurity. Drew Brees had no excuse for what he did. He'd been in the NFL for a long time. He spent his adult career surrounded by black men, and yet when he saw them taking a knee, that white privilege in him came out with a vengeance. That white entitlement came out with a vengeance. How dare these niggers? He didn't care that he was only in the NFL because a black city saved his career, or that he works with black men who, if they decide to, they could let him get beat by the defensive lineman like a piñata. He showed absolutely no gratitude for what black people did for him. It would have been one thing if Brees had simply kept his big yap shut and said nothing about it, but his white privilege wouldn't let him do that. He had to say something, as did that shrew he calls his wife. So what Patterson's doing is not new at all. In the end, so many of these little bigots who owe everything to black people, you can tell that they seethe about that. They may put up a good front and they may have on a pasted-on smile, but the truth is they absolutely resent it. And they can't wait to show their behinds to black people the first chance they get, and I'm telling you that's not okay. All these white media and entertainment figures who made their livings off of black people, who owe everything they have to black people, albeit in the case of Patterson to a fictional one, and yet they can't wait to turn around and show us their behinds. Even CNN couldn't make a pretense of defending James Patterson. They pointed out that the industries that Patterson was whining about remain predominantly white, overwhelmingly white. White people in the U.S. are only 60% of the population, with white males being half of that number, so white males make up about 30% of the population, allegedly. Yet the New York Times found that 89% of books published in 2018 were written by white authors. And the Writers Guild of America West, in a 2021 report, found that 77% of screenwriters are white. And when you look at screenwriters as a total, white men are more than half of all screenwriters. That's what James Patterson's complaining about. 30% of the population make up over 50% of the screenwriters, and if you've been to the multiplex lately or if you've watched a TV show, you know it's not because they're writing these awesome stories. So that puts the lie to what James Patterson was saying, and that explains, of course, why he's done an about-face. People just reminding him of how stupid what he said really is. So if white males are disproportionately represented among writers, then what is it that James Patterson and these others are whining about in the first place? This is insecurity talking. Same thing happened with sports. They told themselves for the longest time that white athletes were the pinnacle of physical prowess, and they talked that for decades. They claimed that black people were physically inferior. They constantly compared themselves to black people, saying, well, there are physical differences you see, and God just made them inferior, blah, blah, blah. But nobody ever seemed to notice that these superior athletes and their cheerleaders in the white media never actually competed against a black athlete. Well, at the turn of the 20th century, when they finally could no longer avoid having to do so, not only did black athletes prove they weren't inferior, they took over the world of sports and turned it into a globe-spanning, multi-billion-dollar juggernaut. Today, nobody tries to claim that black athletes are inferior. Instead, they grumble and gripe about, we should never have let them in. And this is where this nonsense that we're seeing, all of this phony victimhood is coming from. They're sounding the alarm that we need to use our position while we still got it to lock so-and-so out. One thing's for sure. When you take a look at the movies and the TV shows, you can tell that what's being put out there in front of the masses clearly is not the best writing of the 21st century. And speaking of bad writers, to be bluntly honest, James Patterson is mostly hype. It makes sense that he would be nervous and anxiety-ridden about the prospect of the old boys club that made him rich and famous accidentally turning into a meritocracy. I actually tried to read an Alex Cross novel way back in the day. This was when Morgan Freeman was playing the role. It was my first attempt at reading a James Patterson book, and I haven't repeated that mistake since. I don't know what the heck was worse about Patterson's writing, the asinine plot, if it could be called that, because the situations that he was setting up all throughout his book just seemed like he was trying to top himself with what ludicrous scenario he could come up with next. To me, it was clearly a hack trying to do his impersonation of what he thinks a clever plot might look like. From what I remember, his dialogue was so wooden and campy, even a soap opera would have more self-respect than to use it. And his character development was completely undeveloped. The worst part is Patterson is one of the best-selling authors of all time, allegedly. That's the power of the white media, being able to pick and choose who the winners are. This is what Patterson and others are so scared and angry about. They know their achievements aren't due to skill or hard work, that their skin color has more to do with where they've gotten in life than any of their effort. So when James Patterson sees one or two black people in the room, or he walks in and instead of seeing an all-white room, he sees, why is it that there's not all white writers here? When he sees that, he goes on full alert. Because he knows he didn't get to where he is through being an excellent writer. He got there through his connections, and his connections were the result of living in a society that prizes whiteness and has assigned material benefits to it. So when he sees that his given career field is beginning to slowly but surely have some cracks in the white wall, making it where there's now the prospect you may actually have to prove yourself, well, of course, he's going to cry foul. And we see that he's not alone. Now, this is the level of whining that's been going on when there's been practically no shift in the balance of white male representation in any of these industries. They're just angry that they saw one or two black writers or on a YouTube video or something. Imagine how loud the whining will be when there's a real shift. They control 90+% of the landscape. They're still in positions where a numerical minority is able to arbitrarily assign themselves whatever they want. If this is what they're doing when they still control 97% of everything, imagine how hysterical they'll become if they lose 5 or 7%. As black people, we have disproportionate influence on the culture because of the vibrancy of our culture and our natural ingenuity. We've managed to do this as an underclass. This has never happened in human history. And when you have a society that's thoroughly in the grip of white supremacy, they look at everything we do, and as far as they're concerned, any moves we make, they look and say, this is what they're doing when they have no power. Imagine what they could do if they had just a little bit. So that's the reason why they're hyper-paranoid about it. Any little change is going to have vast importance to them. That's going to take on huge significance because they're looking and going, oh God, the shift has already started, just like it did in sports. Oh God, the landslide has begun. The James Pattersons and the Drew Breeses and the others, they live in a state of perpetual fear. And their fear is well-founded. They know that what they have isn't the result of their own hard work, dent in industry. The white media puts out propaganda nonstop to lionize and glorify whiteness as a way to legitimize their racist status quo that they've manufactured. The reality is that white supremacy has held progress back. Thanks to white supremacy, humanity has regressed, it's devolved, it's moved backwards. Humanity would be a lot farther along in its progress and development had these white supremacists not seized control of most of the world. First, they created a global condition of depravity, brutality, and violence, exactly what was going on in their homes before they got out in the 15th century. And then they have frozen the world just like that. And the world is dying. Even the planet itself is going into convulsions. Nothing moves unless white supremacy feels that it's not a threat. But there is no greater threat to a system of corruption than change. Any change is threatening, so any change must be crushed. In fact, they want to control people's minds so that they can't even conceive of changing things. They saturate the planet in their propaganda, calling itself entertainment. See, James Patterson, this lets you know these are the people who are making the entertainment that you like, that you read, that you watch. This is their mentality. These are the people who are doing it. Talk about a first world problem. People are starving, dying, suffering, and James Patterson's biggest concern in life? He thinks the writers' rooms are no longer all white, and that makes this elderly hack feel insecure. He and his fellow whiners, they never look at their own writing, which I'll bet hasn't evolved or changed or improved since they were first selected by the white media powers that be to be big-time, big-money authors. Keep in mind, up until now, people like James Patterson have long lectured black people in media that the reason the writers' rooms are always all white is because, well, the white writers, especially the white male ones, they just write better stories. Hey, the studios only care about money. They don't care about race. They've been saying that for 100 years. They said if black people would apply themselves, why, it's your writing you should be looking at. There would be more black people in the writer's room. You gotta improve your writing. The studios only care about green. They don't care about black and white. Now, because there's one, maybe two less white guys in the writer's room, now we got all this screaming and these hysterics that Hollywood doesn't care about green and only cares about race. That's all it took for them to decide that they were going to turn their back on their own rhetoric. That's all it took. And this is what James Patterson calls racism. What he's showing is he doesn't know what racism is at all. But then again, he doesn't have to because there's no penalty for him telling lies like this. Racism is not a factor in his life, so he can go ahead and say that anything is racism. There's not an all-white writer's room. That's racism. Oh my God, my movie script got turned down. That's racism. The Man on the Moon. That's racism. He can go ahead and do that because there's no punishment for that kind of stupidity. Not for him, there's not. When's the last time you heard a black person whining that they can't get a writing gig, so that's the biggest race issue in their lives? It just goes to show how little some demographics have to complain about. When you teach a victim mentality to people who are oppressed or marginalized, the worst that could possibly happen is that person may never live up to their potential. They may never actually challenge and topple the forces holding them down. On the other hand, when you take the privileged people in the society and you teach them a phony victim mentality, then you're teaching people with power that they're victims of something. And since they have power and a society that doesn't repress them, they're going to act on whatever fear, anger, or paranoia that's been spoon-fed to them. And they'll try to do something about it because they know the society won't stop them. That's how you get a Dylan Roof or a Peyton Gendron and so many others. When James Patterson and other privileged individuals begin spouting their phony lies about being disadvantaged based on race, that's not some victimless crime. That's exactly the same well that the white replacement theory and other lies about college admissions and such, which forms the backbone of all of the pretense for anti-black violence, is based on. The reason that there's so much hate and so much violence coming from a certain segment of the society is that some people in the society were chosen by the society to be handed things. And even with all that, with everything spoon-fed to some people on a platinum platter, owning and controlling all the major arenas and levers of power, they still have the nerve to say they want more. What happens when you put a pen and paper into the hands of someone with a mentality like that? Worse, what happens when you put a gun into the hands of someone with that mentality? Entitlement plus racial privilege is a deadly combination. Well, I'll say this about James Patterson. There's a lot of things that the world sees when it looks at people like him, but the one thing nobody sees is a victim. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Fresner Peralt, Fidel Phillips, Moshe Ben Abraham, Delvian Burton, and Rose Arnold. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.